Italian Wine Podcast. Chin Chin with Italian wine people.
Hello, my name is Monty Waldin. I am with Ian Daggeter, who's probably the greatest expert on Italian grape varieties in the world. Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Monty. It's great to be here.
Right, let's first of all talk about the Aglianico grape, or the Aglianico grape. You have said that this is one of the world's great red grapes. Why did you say that?
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm actually in the minority. Some very famous colleagues I really get along with have sort of poked fun at me for that statement. I do, however, believe that Aglianico is really one of Italy's 3 greatest grapes, and I think it's one of the world's 10 greatest grapes. And the reason why I say that is in 30 years of tasting Aglianico wines, it was clear to me that there was potential. Let me just explain that this sort of happening isn't just a one-time thing. I had exactly the same sort of belief with Nerello Mascalese, and that was easy because my family originates from Sicily. My whole paternal side of the family is from Catania, and we actually owned land on Etna. Vines, really, that unfortunately my grandfather decided to sell off. And already then, you could tell that Nerello Mascalese wines, this is back in the 70s and 80s when nobody talked of Etna, you could tell it was just a potentially amazing, amazing wine. And exactly the same thing is true of Aglianico delle Vulture, whereby I tasted so many great wines from Paternoster and D'Angelo back in the 75 and 77 and 78 vintages that, though rustic, really showed a lot of potential. So I think the problem is that Aglianico has not benefited from the plethora of great, talented producers that Barolo, that Barbaresco, that Brunello have had over the decades. And that has made it so that Aglianico, the grape variety, has not been able to shine in its wines. But mark my words, Aglianico gives these wonderful wines that are magically perfumed, red roses, tobacco, darker fruit, depending on where the Aglianico variety grows, lots of acidity, lots of tannins, and a very noble tasting red wine. That is very age-worthy. So yes, I think that Aglianico is one of the world's 10 greatest grapes.
So when normal consumers hear wine experts talking about tannin and long-lived wines, that does tend to put people off because you think,
Totally.
I'm never going to be able to drink it. And whenever it becomes drinkable and softens up, I'm going to be a grandparent. So how do you get around that? What do winemakers have to do to make these wines a little bit more drinkable?
That's a really great question because, sometimes us wine geeks tend to get carried away with the age-worthiness of wines. And yes, this wine will be great in 54 years, but nobody has that sort of patience. Nobody has a cellar anymore where to store wines properly. The great thing about Aglianico is, though it is an age-worthy wine, more so than Barolo and Barbaresco and even some great Brunellos, it is actually readier to drink sooner because it has this fruit-forward personality. That's especially true of Aglianico in the Taurasi area of Campania and even more so in the Vulture area of Basilicata. These are fresh, plummy, red-berried, red-cherried wines right from the start that are very good to drink already 5 years after the harvest, but that can age 10, 20, 30 years. So I think Aglianico has a lot of reasons by which to please people. Again, the main problem is very poor winemaking for the past 30 or 40 years. We're in Campania and in Basilicata. You only had, I don't want to be negative, let's say 15 to 20 wine estates that really were good at what they were doing.
Isn't one of the problems with Aglianico the fact that it can be drunk fairly early? It's a very juicy kind of pizza wine. Means people say, well, how is it possible that a pizza wine could be considered one of Italy's greats?
Well, Monty, for me, pizza wine is the ultimate compliment because if I have to die on a desert island, besides taking Gwyneth Paltrow with me, I would take a juicy Neapolitan pizza. Nothing better than, San Marzano or Pomodori del Piennolo tomatoes with authentic anchovies and beautiful buffalo mozzarella. And that is what we call in Italy cibo degli dei, that is God's food. So since there is nothing better in the world than a well-made pizza, hence an Aglianico, which is a pizza wine, there is no better compliment. So all kidding aside, I think people have to get over the snobbery of wine, whereby you have to have, if you read some books, it's really a laugh, right? Because they're telling you have to have this red wine with roast partridge or roast wood grouse. First of all, there aren't any wood grouse left. And secondly, nobody eats that stuff. So people eat pizza. People eat pasta. I mean, I love pasta with ragu and pasta with tomato sauce, and I want a wine that goes well with that. And I think Aglianico, clearly not the really age-worthy stuff, but an everyday Aglianico goes marvelously well with that.
The three main regions for this particular grape, the Aglianico, are Taurasi, Taburno, and Vulture, which is spelt vulture, as in the bird. Tell me a little bit about those three terroirs and what makes the Aglianico from these different terroirs taste different.
It's actually very simple. It sounds complicated, but it's very simple. Taurasi and Taburno are in the region of Campania. That is where Naples is. That is where the islands of Ischia and Capri are also located. Vulture, or the vulture, is in Basilicata. Basilicata is Italy's smallest region that is located between Italy's heel, which is Puglia, and Italy's toe, which is Calabria, because Italy is a boot-shaped country. And Basilicata is tucked in between the heel and the boot.
It's the instep, right?
Totally.
That's where my mother-in-law is from.
That's absolutely very well put. These mother-in-laws. The key thing is that if you think of what Taurasi, Taburno, and Vulture are, they're extinct volcanoes. And Aglianico is one of the grapes in this world that loves volcanoes. It's such a great grape variety that it will grow well just about anywhere. That may actually be one of its fallings because it gives you a decent wine anywhere. And I think that contributes to its lack of recognition. But when you grow it on this volcanic soil, it just reaches a different stratosphere and becomes one of the world's greatest red wines. I would argue that Pinot Gris, which is viewed as Pinot Grigio, it's exactly the same grape, it's just different languages, which is viewed as a very simple grape and wine. In reality, when you put it on volcanic soils, like the Rang in Alsace, it gives you one of the 10 greatest white wines in the world.
So what is the effect of the volcanic soil on the Aglianico? How does it work? What's the mechanism?
There's actually a science to this, and people are working on it in universities all over Italy. The main thing is that when you grow Aglianico on volcanic soils, to make it very simple, you get a very elegant, refined wine that is flinty and very mineral and very long aging. It's not as immediately charming as some other Aglianicos that are grown on richer soils, but it's remarkably deep and precise and penetrating. And the great thing about wine is you don't have to be an expert to recognize a great wine. If you give anyone, a beginner or a wine expert, a very good Aglianico from a volcanic soil, they all immediately identify it to be a great wine.
So hang on, if you're on a volcano, you're going to be way above sea level, right? 600 to 700 meters. How does Aglianico get itself ripe at such altitudes?
Well, it really depends on the slope and where the sun's rays hit. So you can actually grow at 1,000 meters above sea level, which is about 3,300 feet to 3,500 feet. And what happens is you're way up there where it's cold and where you would think these poor grapes never ripen. But in fact, because you're up on the slopes at a very steep gradient, the sun rays hit the land in such a way that the grapes actually ripen. It's a longer growing season. So you will be picking grapes, for example, in the Vulture in November, which is unheard of, right? And for example, in Sicily, unless you're on Etna, you're going to be picking grapes already in August. But because the hang time is so long on Vulture...
What do you mean by hang time?
How long the grapes are allowed or able to resist on the vine. The greatest wines in the world are all issued from grapes that have been allowed to live long on the vine. Because as long as the grape is sitting there on the vine, its metabolism, that means all its vital activities are still working. It's a bit more complicated than that, because now we know that when you take grapes away from the vine, when you detach them, biologic processes are still going on. So it's not as cut and dried as we once thought. But for the most part, if you leave grapes hanging, these grapes are living and they're building new molecules and they're building new aromas and they're building new flavors. And ultimately, the wine is much more complex and much more interesting. So Aglianico can benefit from a very long hang time because it's not picked in August, it's picked in November. And that inherently allows for a more complex wine. Then, of course, you have to know what you're doing. And if you don't know how to make wine, the wine's going to be horrible. But you're starting off with a potentially really great matter.
So one of the things you said about Aglianico in your book is that it dominates its terroir. Why is that a problem?
It's a problem because I think it's much easier, although this could sound geeky, it's much easier for people to understand this wine is born off this type of soil, and therefore it's different from this other one that is born on this other soil. Aglianico tends to give you very much a similar wine just about everywhere it is grown. However, if you have a little bit of experience and you pay a little bit of attention, you realize that the Aglianicos that are born on sand are a little lighter bodied, they're a little more fragrant, while the ones, for example, off the volcanic soils are much deeper, darker, flintier. That may not be as evident to everybody out there, but to people who really are into wine, it is apparent.
What about Taburno in Benevento? You said that's near Naples, right? So what makes that place special?
Taburno and Taurasi are both near Naples. Taurasi is about an hour and a half from Naples in the Apennine range, right in the middle of Italy. And near
a range of mountains, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a dorsal of mountains that runs north to south right through Italy. Taurasi is near the city of Avellino, while, as you say...
That's where my brother-in-law is from.
All right, well, it's a good place to go visit then. And Taburno, on the other hand, is about 2.5 hours away from Naples by car, and it is near, as you say, the city of Benevento. And Taburno is another extinct volcano. It's moving towards Puglia. The Aglianico there, first of all, it's a different biotype. Now, I don't want to make this too complicated, but in reality, people have planted just about everything everywhere because they wanted to try different things.
Because they're Italian.
Yeah, because they're Italian, because it's been allowed, and it's very unfortunate that it was allowed, but that would take us too far. But to make a long story short, the Taburno Aglianico is a different biotype that gives you a higher acid wine, and that gives you a wine that is more marked by tobacco and underbrush notes, as opposed to the Taurasi Aglianico Campania, which is very Nebbiolo-like. It is marked by red rose and red cherry notes. The Taburno Aglianico, in fact, is locally known as Amaro, which is not bitter, but actually that's the dialect word for acid, because the Taburno Aglianico is very high on acid, and the high acidity of all Aglianico wines is one of the things that explains why these wines age so well.
Doesn't that also explain why they're actually really nice to drink as well? Because you have some wines that kind of taste like sticky berries.
Absolutely.
It's like eating jam, right? And it just really tiring. Is that people, when consumers hear about and people talk about acidity, they always see that as a negative thing. Why isn't it in the case of Aglianico?
Oh, no, absolutely not. I think, you have to make a distinction between wines that are going to show well in a tasting and wines that are going to show well at dinner time. And you've got to consider that in some parts of the world, wine was never part of the daily diet, certainly in North America. If anybody remembers back in the 70s and 80s, if you used to go have lunch in even a well-known restaurant, everybody was sitting there with bottles of Perrier. Today it might be San Pellegrino or Panna. But back then it was Perrier. Very few people drank wine. So wine was never part of these cultures, and therefore these individuals who ended up getting into wine were taken by very rich, jammy wines that really tasted well in a tasting. But when you have to eat with them, they're horrible because they're jammy, they're roasted, they have alcohols of 16%, they have sugar levels, and who wants to have an alcoholic raspberry juice with his roast loin or his steak or even his hamburger? Nobody wants that. And I think acidity is key because, of course, it cleanses your mouth, it's refreshing, it gets you ready for another morsel. And all these high-acid wines that are now becoming much more in fashion are key to having a great time at a meal. In places where you've historically had wine with food, people have always enjoyed these high-acid wines, and the sugary bombs were less popular. That may have changed in recent times, but for the most part, it's true.
Final question. How do you rate Aglianico in general in terms of value for money?
It's very good if you get the right Aglianico. Again, the problem with Aglianico is you need to get a good producer. I'm not offending anybody if I say that if you buy a Barolo 9 times out of 10, and probably even 9.9 times out of 10, you're going to get a very sound wine, an enologically well-made wine. You may like it, you may not like it, that's another matter, but it's going to be a flawless wine. I'm not sure I can say that about the Aglianicos made in Italy. I would say that some of them have flaws, and some of them are less interesting. But if you get the one made by a right producer, and there are many, it's a juicy wine, it's a great wine, it's not expensive, and it's a very satisfying wine.
Ian, thanks very much for sharing your love of and knowledge of Aglianico.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to having a pizza with you and a large glass of it.
Me too.
At some stage in the future. Thanks, Ian.
Me too.
Follow us at Italian Wine Podcast on Facebook.